All right. Tip number two. We're doing episode, I think it's number 5 of our matchup guide series. Today we're going to be talking about Death Shadow variants versus Living End. So first, let's start about like, all right, you're in the blind game 1. How do you identify that you're up against Living End? Obviously, some of the big cycle cards are dead giveaways. So like Architects of Will, Curator of Mysteries, Strike River Winder, to a lesser extent, things like Street Wraith, Grief. But the lands can also be a pretty big giveaway, like Botanical Sanctum, Breeding Pool on turn 1. Living End is usually looking for one of those, especially Botanical Sanctum. That's like a pretty big Living End giveaway right now. But Breeding Pool is usually like a Cascade deck at the moment. So you can at least kind of narrow it down a little bit. But all right, you've identified you're against Living End. In the blind, obviously, game 1, what becomes your game plan? Find counter spells. That's it. That is your plan. That is your hope. Stop Living Ends. Obviously, Hand Disruption is great for taking things like Force of Negation or taking a Cascade spell out of hand. But ultimately, if you don't find a counter spell, they're really likely to find another copy of Living End or another copy of a Cascade spell. So you really need to be able to stop those spells on the stack. Like your Hand Disruption really falls off after turn 2, because after that, they're going to be able to just like cast whatever Cascade spell they draw into. So you're not really going to have a chance to like Thought Seize one away, Inquisition, anything like that. Ragavan and Dragon's Rage Channeler are both really good for aggressive pressure. Ledger Shredder is great for helping to find those counter spells, because not only does it trigger off you casting multiple things, triggers off your opponent casting a Cascade spell and a Living End. So you do get a little more connive ability there. It might be useful to like connive away that extra Ragavan, connive away the Croxa, stuff like that. Get some dudes in your yard in case they do resolve a Living End. You're not just completely dead on board. But usually, if your opponent's able to resolve one game 1, you're in a fairly rough spot. It is useful to have a couple like a piece or two of removal, especially like a Terminate or a Delirium enabled in Holy Heat. If you do get to the point where you can't counter the Living End, because at least you can like try to snag a couple guys. Maybe Shadow can get into Abyss mode quickly. But I would pretty aggressively bin like extra removal to connive triggers and not try to stockpile removal off expressive iterations, things like that. So usually the play pattern game 1 kind of ends up being, all right, you've got your Hand Disruption or your Ragavan, your opponent cycles something, you either hit with another Hand Disruption spell or expressive iteration, something. Opponent cycles some more on turn 2. Turn 3, things really start turning the corner. And you need to have, like I said, this Drowning Lock, Spell Pierce, something like that main board. Or a Living End is probably going to outsize you very quickly. Once you do recognize that it's Living End, like any sort of play conservative line needs to go on the back foot. Like you're the beatdown deck. You need to be fetching, shocking, bolt yourself, get Shadow down, whatever you can do to like get a significant clock on your opponent. Because Living End's going to be a Wrath if you don't have a counterspell anyway. So since your life total isn't under direct jeopardy, you need to get the game over with. Best way I can express it. Croxa is a little lackluster. Like, I like Croxa in the yard. I don't like Croxa being cast for 2. Because usually it's just going to ditch some extra cycler into hand that doesn't really matter. But coming out of the graveyard, a 6/6 body that's swinging, ditching a card, or bolting is a heck of a lot better. Plus, you get that free trigger after they Living End back. So just keep that in mind. Like, if you can avoid just hard casting a Croxa, usually would try to use it for like connive fuel instead. So post board, definitely where things get a lot more interesting. It's less of a goldfish on one side and more of like back and forth counterplay. And kind of what I mean by that is you're each taking steps to try to account for your opponent's hate pieces. In our case, we're bringing in like extra counter spells, usually some sort of grave nuke or grave hate piece like Unlicensed Hearse, Nihil Spellbomb, Soul Guide Lantern. Our opponent's trying to determine like what we're bringing in. Do they need to be bringing in more of like mystical disputes to fight over counter spells? Do they need to be bringing in Force of Vigors, Foundation Breakers, stuff like that to fight over the artifact based grave hate? Do they need Leyline of Sanctity to fight over hand hate? So for us, most of the time, I'd say like 99% of the time, you're just bringing in whatever you've got available. So, for example, with one of our standard like Grixis lists, Flusterstorm is like an S tier bring in. Spell Pierces are going to be fantastic. Unlicensed Hearses are okay. I put Unlicensed Hearse like below Soul Guide Lantern on the effectiveness scale because there's a lot of times that your opponent can just outrace Unlicensed Hearse. Like if I'm on the play and they go turn one, cycle something, and I go turn one, nothing, or I go turn one, hand disruption, take a cascade spell. They go turn one, cycle something. I go turn two, hers. They go turn two, cycle two things plus a street wraith maybe, and I can exile two. Turn three, I untap, exile something, or and they cycle another street wraith, and then living in. They're probably going to get one or two things back. Or the better play for them is always like cast your uh, cascade spell, put the living in on the stack. We have to respond by exiling whatever's in the graveyard, and then they get to like get priority back, cycle wraith, and just get back a couple unblockable 3/5s that we have a really difficult time dealing with. But like Soul Guide Lantern, just being able to exile everything at once is fantastic. But most of the time against Living In now, I would recommend relying more on your counter spells than your grave hate. Uh, with things like Unlicensed Hearse, Soul Guide Lantern, they're going to be bringing in Foundation Breakers, Force of Vigor. They're going to have answers for the artifact based hate. When it comes to the counter spells, it's more of just Force of Negation, Mystical Dispute, Grief, which Grief can hit the grave hate pieces, especially if it's like a turn two play like Unlicensed Hearse anyway. But it's a little bit easier to fight on the stack than it is to play out a permanent. Brazen Borrower is another one that can take out an artifact hate piece right before they're set to go off. But yeah, like the hard counters for Living In, I think, are your best bet. Unlicensed Hearse is down here. Turok, probably like in line with Unlicensed Hearse. It's a lot better on the play than the draw because on the play you can play it out on turn two. You're not afraid of Living In on their turn two. Start picking up some counters on it whenever they cycle something, and you can get Turok to a fairly sizable threat pretty quickly. And then like Mystical Dispute, if you're planning on countering their counters, if you're on a heavy counter plan, then Mystical Dispute gets a lot better for being able to hit Force Negation, opposing Mystical Disputes, anything like that. So I'd kind of say like S tier, A tier would be like your Soul Guide Lanterns. Um, we'll talk about some other shadow variants in a second, but just like out of your typical list, your Soul Guide Lanterns, Nihil Spellbomb would be like A minus tier because it does run into the issue with Leyline, which we'll talk about that as well. But that kind of gives you a little bit of a priority system. So Leyline, or let's talk about, I guess we kind of briefly mentioned what they're bringing in. Usually against a deck like Grixis Shadow, Endurance, Mystical Dispute, Force of Vigor, Foundation Breaker, any of those could be coming in. The artifact hate's really dependent on like how much uh, artifact based grave hate they're expecting us to bring in. So there are a lot of times where if you go really heavy on like Fluster Storms, Mystical Disputes, you can just make Force of Negation or Force of Vigor and Foundation Breaker like a dead card in their hand, which is extremely nice. Like anytime you have one less thing to worry about and all of your cards are relevant, that's a big plus. But I wouldn't bank on that because there's no guarantee that that's how the game's going to play out. It's just a little plus that you have access to. Leyline of Sanctity post board is a card that usually out of these unfair decks, I recommend people take the approach of if my opponent has Leyline and a good functional hand, you probably weren't beating it anyway. Like if uh my living end opponent has Leyline on as a pregame effect into like turn one grief, maybe cycle a wraith or cycle a one drop, turn two land drop, cycle, turn three cascade spell backed up by force negation. Like I am never winning that game. And that's okay. Like my opponent had to have literal everything. They did, so be it. Move on. But if Leyline of Sanctity is something that you're wanting to kind of take out of the equation, Soul Guide Lantern over Nihil Spellbomb, because Soul Guide Lantern does not target your opponent when you sacrifice it. Unlicensed Hearse is also better in those if you're concerned about Leyline, better than Nihil Spellbomb because it also doesn't target your opponent. Surgical Extraction is not really where you want to be. You can Surgical Extraction the living ends, but you still have to fight over that first one and like pick and choose your spot to fight. So just keep that in mind. So let's talk about sideboarding for some other shadow options. So for example, Jund, we play a lot of Jund Shadow with Dolphy in the main. Dolphy's fantastic against living end. There's a fun little interaction sequence that it's good to be aware of. If your opponent casts a casket, if you have a Dolphy out and the Dolphy doesn't have summoning sickness, if your opponent casts a living end and so casts the cascade spell, puts the living end on the stack. If you sacrifice the Dolphy before the living end resolves, then the living end will bring back the Dolphy from your graveyard, exile itself to the Dolphy once the Dolphy comes back, because the spell doesn't go to the graveyard until it's done resolving. And in this case, it would go to the exile zone instead because it brought back the Dolphy exiles it. And then when your Dolphy goes to the next turn and loses summoning sickness, you can sacrifice it, recast their living end, wipe their board, get your board back, including the Dolphy that you just sacrificed to cast the living end, and essentially negate that entire living end. Works way better against Shardless Agent than it does against a Violent Outburst on your turn, because you do have to wait for that Dolphy to lose summoning sickness again. A nice little play around there is you can always like Inquisition or Thoughtseize yourself and take your Dolphy, and that way when they cast the living end, you get the Dolphy back. It exiles living end. You can start it that way. Or if you've got a Dolphy on board, you can Lightning Bolt it or Fatal Push it, something like that, if it's got summoning sickness and you need to get it into the graveyard immediately. So in the Jund list, most everything is the same. Like Turoxid and OK bring in, but it's still in like that B tier. Chalice of the Void is a really good bring in. I'd put this more in like the A to A plus tier. It's really good. Obviously, it's stopping the living in themselves, making sure that they don't have a chance to resolve. Whereas, like a lot of your grave hate, they're still going to resolve a living in, and still like wrath your board, but Chalice keeps them from getting that effect. The downside is with like Force of Vigor, Foundation Breaker, Brazen Borrower, um, Force of Negation, your opponents have like a lot of ways of interacting with Chalice. So a lot of times you're just going to want to like play it down on turn one and hope it sticks around. It's really tough to have a Chalice in hand and wait until like the last possible second, because you're giving them more draw steps for grief, force, any sort of interaction. So it's kind of like, what's that old there's some infomercial, set it and forget it, but I forgot what the product was. But same thing with Chalice of the Void. You're just throwing it down, leaving it there, hoping that it's good enough. I've seen people play like Hidetsugu consumes all, and probably too slow most of the time. Like maybe if you have a turn one Ragavan, turn two Hidetsugu, turn three they haven't cast anything and it pops, but your opponent's just like not gonna play into that, knowing that they're going to exile their yard in 2 turns. So the 3/3 body a little bit less exciting because they can just refuel afterwards and go off. As with like the Grixis variants, game plan is just like go all in as fast as you can. Threats are your friend. Hand disruption's your friend. You really need a hate piece, but we'll talk about mulligan decisions in a second. Last variants are like the heavy blue black variants, like Esper and Demir and stuff like that. Esper Teferi is an S tier card against Living End. Stop them from actually casting their Living End off the Cascade spell, as well as any of your typical sideboard cards, like for all these variants, your Soul Guide Lanterns, Hearses, whatever. Silence is really good if you happen to be running it. It's probably right in line with counter spells and effectiveness. The only problem with it is it's just stopping for a turn, because if they cast like a shardless agent, you have to respond with silence before the cascade trigger resolves. If you don't have a chance after they cascade and hit the living end, put the living end on the stack. But if you silence before they cast the living end, then they're just not going to cast it. They're just going to take their shardless agent and move on with their life. So you have to accept that that's just like a stifle for a turn. What is it? There's that deafening silence, I think, the 1 mana white enchantment that silences, or that doesn't silence, it says like they can only cast one thing a turn. That Archon of Emeria and some of the Shadow Blade variants that we've tried out has been really good. So any of those like only cast one spell effects are very solid. There's the white 2-drop Ethersworn Canonist. You can only cast one non-artifact spell. It's good against Violent Outburst, bad against Shardless Agent. Necromentia in the sideboard. A lot of these 3-drop plays like Archon, Necromentia, Teferi are really good on the play and really who knows on the draw. Like you really want to hit these effects before before your opponent has a chance to put their first cascade spell on the stack. So a lot of the times they're going to like steal game 2, because more than likely you're going to have a rough time game 1. You don't know what you're up against. They catch you off guard with cycle, living in. Game 2, you're on the play. You have a chance to Necromentia, Teferi, something like that before your opponent has a chance to untap with their 3rd land. So those effects are really good on the play, but on the draw, they're often not going to be enough. So you need to have like a secondary plan, whether it be a Chalice, Hearse, Soul Guide, whatever. Just don't rely on like your 3 mana spell at sorcery speed on turn 3 on the draw to be effective enough. In the blue base variants, there's also been a lot of use of what is it, invasive surgery, the white instant that counters a sorcery and exiles all the other copies if you have delirium. Uh, invasive, it's invasive surgery. And I think there's like another one that's printed too that's like the same effect basically, but it's 2 mana instead of 1. Um, but invasive surgery could be an idea out of some of the Grixis lists if you want another answer to like Living End or Rhino's Test of Talents. Is that it? So this is invasive surgery, counter sorcery. Then if you have delirium, it basically surgicals all the other all the other copies out. Test of Talents. Yeah, so Test of Talents does the same thing, but for an instant or a sorcery, and then they get to draw a card if they've got any copies in their hand. But obviously, like Living End doesn't want to have copies of Living End in their hand, so it could give a nice backup option if you're wanting to just like surgical all of them without running surgical. Any other? So we can talk about some of like the Saga variants since we've been messing around with those recently. Usually, you can tutor up Soul Guide Lantern or Nihil Spellbomb. Golgari gets access to Endurance, which is really good here. Just like evoke an Endurance, shuffle away their yard. Endurance goes to the grave. They resolve Living End. You get your Endurance back. So you get at least like a 3/4 body for your troubles. But other than that, that's like everything that Rakdos, more just like the same Grave Hate, Dothy, Hearse, Chalice. Again, anything like that is relevant. So let's talk about like hands to keep. Usually we just like default to talking with Grixis because I think that's the variant that most people are playing right now. So you're in game 2 or game 3. You know the matchup you're in. What are you looking for? What are you not looking for? For me, against Living End especially, less so against Rhinos because they have more interaction, but more against Living End, I'm really looking for a hand with Ragavan to where I can get my mana advanced and enough to be able to cast multiple spells when they get to turn 3 because they're going to be playing a cascade spell plus like a Force of Negation or a cascade spell plus a grief. And if you don't have the mana to be able to fight over 2 things on that turn, then you're going to have an issue. Like either you've got Drown in the Lock and Spell Pierce in hand and hope that's enough, or you need to be able to cast 2 full spells like Drown, Flusterstorm, Drown, Mystical Dispute, whatever it is. Hearse plus Hold Up, Drown, or Hearse, Hold Up, Spell Pierce. But if you don't get that mana advantage, then you're going to have a bit of a rough time. The worst thing you can do against these decks is keep like a fair hand. So we're talking like a Channeler into a Shredder into Bauble Iteration with an Unholy Heat and like 2 lands. Because you're just going to get like run over trying to find your interaction. There's going to be some number of those games where you get rewarded, just like top deck an unlicensed hearse, and all of a sudden you have a chance. But a lot of the time, you're just going to be like spinning your wheels, trying to find your interaction, and your opponent is just going to run you over with their actual cascade spells. One thing that is really important to know if you are on the counterspell plan is a lot of Living End decks. It looks like they're kind of upping their count now. A lot of Living End decks are only running 3 copies of Living End. So pay attention when your opponent is revealing their cards. So if you get to the third one, they put another cascade spell on the stack, then you know whether or not they have a fourth copy of Living In, or if they have one in hand, if you like thought seize them and see one, then maybe you want to be more aggressive fighting over the other ones since they only have like 2 left in their library. And I don't believe outside of endurance, they have a way of getting them back into the deck. But it could mean that if your opponent has already like cast 2 living ends and they cast an endurance, maybe you need to be more proactive over fighting over that endurance so they can't get more copies into the graveyard. And on that same note, kind of, if you're, what on earth is that? If you're playing a version with like surgical extraction, then obviously you're going to be more interested in thought seizing or inquisitioning a living end out of your opponent's hand. But if you're playing a counter spell variant, then you're a lot more interested in just like leaving that as a dead card and fighting over the next one. Because most of these builds don't actually have the mana to suspend living end. So if they've got one in hand, it's pretty much dead. Like, you can pitch it to grief, and that's going to be the only use out of that card ever. So if you're able to catch them with one in hand, 9 times out of 10, I would just say, like, completely ignore it. Anything else I really wanted to go over? The backup. So primary game plan has worked. Your post board, you've stopped the living ends, whether it be through grave hate, counter spells, whatever. Now what? Now you cannot be complacent. You cannot sit back and just like draw go, because they will get to 4, 5, 6 mana and just start hard casting Curator, Street Wraith, Riverwinder, Waker, whatever, subtleties, endurances. So like their backup plan when the living in portion doesn't work out too well is still just cast decent on curve creatures. So when you're going to post board, I would not recommend boarding out all of your removal spells. Like, you could probably cut Unholy Heats, Fatal Push if you're running like Lightning Bolt, probably cut that. But I would try to keep in maybe a Terminator too, just to answer anything that does come down. But you got to watch out for those games where like your plan is Ragavan plus Drown in the Lock, Mystical Dispute, or not Mystical Dispute, Flusterstorm, Unlicensed Hearse, and your opponent just goes like turn 2, Brazen Borrower, bounce your guy, turn 3, Endurance, turn 4, Curator, turn 5, Street Wraith. Because if you don't respect that enough, then it will run you over pretty well. Like we've had that happen a few times on the stream, where we just had all the counter spells in the world and our opponent just played out dudes on curve and hit us up pretty bad. Think that's about it, unless anybody in chat's got any questions. I haven't seen any, but yeah, as far as matchup percentages, because for whatever reason people are always interested in that, I'd say for like your base Grixis list, it's a little favored on the Grixis side, but post board, it really depends on the hate choices. Like the more Fluster Storms and Spell Pierces and stuff like that Grixis is running, I think the better. The more they're relying on like Unlicensed Hearse, then I think that gets worse. Do you have any data about win rates with different shadow variants? I've got a lot of out of date data that I need to get up to date at some point. But if nobody has seen this, this is our spreadsheet that is way, way behind. We used to have like hundreds and hundreds of matches on here, but I've been very much slacking on updating it. But like Living End, say with Murktide has been a very good matchup, and I know we've gotten more wins since then. Living End against Jund. This is mostly because of like Dolphy. Without Dolphy, that match would be absolutely abysmal. Do I have Living End on here? Yeah, you can tell how out of date this is. But for the most part, for shadow variants across the board, Living End is like on the positive side. But the farther you get from heavy blue, then you can see the trend of the worse the matchup gets. And I think that speaks a lot to counter spells being the best answer. Blue Black has the best win rate against it. Yeah, but that list is also just like, all right, I've got 3 charms, 4 counterspell, 4 drown, 2 stub, another stub in the board, force, mystical disputes, chalice, surgical. Like, deck feels like anti-Living End half the time. Then you just have like reasonable clocks that are difficult to deal with, plus your hand disruption. And yeah. But yeah, that's it for the Shadow versus Living End matchup guide. So if you have any other matchups you're really wanting to know more about, anything you're curious about, feel free to leave a comment or a question down below. Otherwise, we'll have the next guide up sometime. Not sure when. But hope this helps when you get out there and start squaring off against some Living End opponents yourself. I'll catch y'all next time.